Okay, we are mic'd. We're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see you all here in the room, and welcome as well to those of you joining online. I'm Mariah Besharov. I'm Professor of Organizations and Impact and the Academic Director of the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship here at Oxford. And I'm really thrilled to welcome you all to today's Insights for Action seminar. The seminar series broadly explores how researchers and practitioners within and beyond Oxford are using research insights for action. Today, we're going to focus on impact measurement and dig into the questions around how measurement of impact can be useful and also meaningful for the individuals, organizations, and communities that are at the heart of social change. The seminar today and the conversation I'll have with Karim and Jeremy, who I'll introduce in a minute, builds on a conversation or set of conversations that we've been having at the Skoll Center and with people in our community for a while now, but particularly a conversation we had last September at our community convening here at Said Business School, where we talked about the role of measurement in that, how could measurement be more meaningful? And we talked in particular about an approach that you'll hear more about from Jeremy today that has developed at the organization he leads called the Old Fire Station. So now let me introduce my conversation partners and really the stars of the conversation today, Karim and Jeremy. Karim Harji is a practitioner, educator, and researcher in impact measurement and impact investing. He serves as program director of the Oxford Impact Measurement Program at the Said Business School. He also teaches in the impact investing and impact finance courses that we run here. And he serves as a fellow of the Skoll Center. So welcome, Karim. You have many other activities and accomplishments that we'll hear about over the course of the conversation. Jeremy Spafford is associate director of the Old Fire Station. The Old Fire Station is a multi-form arts center based in Oxford that shares space with the homelessness charity Crisis. And the partnership between Old Fire Station and Crisis has become a nationally recognized model of social inclusion, which we'll hear about, and we'll hear about the learning that has come from that. In addition to operating the Arts Center, Old Fire Station has developed an approach to impact measurement that's grounded in storytelling, and we'll definitely be digging into that in the conversation. And they also organize a festival that some of you may be familiar with, called Marmalade, which operates in partnership with the Skoll World Forum, bringing people together from all over the world every April to talk about power, relationships, and place in the context of social change. And so I'll have a little bit more on that at the end of the conversation. But I want to now get into the discussion around impact measurement and meaningful impact measurement. And I just want to acknowledge we're going to be talking about impact measurement across a variety of contexts, impact investing, social investing, grant making, public funding, and more. And there's certainly important differences across those contexts, particularly in terms of different funding modalities. But we're also going to highlight some of the similarities, particularly similarities around mental models and ways of working. Karim and Jeremy are going to bring different perspectives. They've worked in different parts of this spectrum, but I do, again, think we'll see some, and we'll try to draw out some of the commonalities. So let's get into the conversation. Karim, I'm going to start with you. What is impact measurement, and what can it do for us?
Right. Thank you, Mariah. And it's great to see a full house. And this is, I think, one of those topics that is gaining, again, a renewed set of interest and attraction, but also just a range of perspectives around how to answer this question of what is impact and what is measurement. And it unlocks often a set of other questions of why do we measure and for whom, and what are the consequences of measurement, which I know we're gonna get into. Generally speaking, when we think about impact, often we're referring to long-term changes for people or place or planet. Those changes could be positive or negative. They could be due to the things that you are actually working on. It could be due to a whole lot of other factors, but often we're trying to understand what change looks like for different types of organizations, issues, and places, and really try and make that a bit more specific around what types of those changes were due to you, how much of that change occurred, what was the time horizon, what was the magnitude of that change, et cetera. So there's a number of different components around impact that I think are still somewhat contested, but also we've had many decades of study and kind of technical approaches to dealing with. I think for me, the starting point actually needs to be around this question of why are we measuring? Because that really drives a lot of what measurement actually looks like. And I would say that one helpful construct is to think about the whys in terms of 3 different buckets. The first is we're trying to prove something when we measure stuff. Often we have some idea of what we think change looks like, and we want to be able to use a set of tools to prove that change happened according to what we thought it might look like. Often that's more quantitative, it might be much more specific, but it doesn't have to be. That's very different from if you're trying to look at measurement as a tool to improve certain things. And often we're asking questions around, do some groups benefit more than others? Are some groups less worse off than they would have been without our intervention? And there you often need a blend of quantitative and qualitative approaches to measurement. And often in the spaces that we work in, it's not just about proving something or even improving something. We're often trying to learn new things around how we combine capital and people and different inputs to try and understand what is working, what could be interesting to scale up, et cetera. And in those cases, the learning components around measurement require completely different ways of approaching measurement than the more prove style interventions. Often you're asking questions, you are looking at patterns, you're trying to uncover new insights. And so I think for me, one of the kind of fundamental pieces of this, what is impact measurement, has to start with why do we do it? And what are the purposes of impact measurement? And obviously then gets into questions of who cares about impact measurement? Because there are people that are affected by measurement, and there's people who are doing the measurement, and there's people who are using the measurement. And those are often not the same people. And that's why meaningful measurement is such a powerful construct, because it asks all these questions in such an elegant way. But as you can see, even with this one term, there's a lot of nuance underneath that. So maybe that gives us enough to get started.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I love the prove, improve, learn framework. I think it's really helpful because people are coming at this with very different objectives and different needs.
Yeah.
So thank you. So Jeremy, tell us a little bit about how you at the old fire station understand and how you practice impact measurement.
Sure, thank you. And hello, everyone. Nice to see you. So we're just up the road. If you haven't found us yet, you should do. We're not very far away. And we're an art centre. We're unusual because, as Maya said, we share the building with Crisis, a homelessness charity, which some of you will have heard of. And we do professional public art in the way that you'd expect us to. I'd love to talk about that for hours, but it's not particularly relevant to this conversation. But what is distinctive is that, as well as engaging the public in all sorts of opportunities around arts across all different forms, we're also looking the whole time at how we can try and include people facing extreme disadvantage in that process, either simply as audience and participants, but also as co-creators, as trainees, as volunteers, as members of our staff team, as members of our board, part of our decision-making process. And we're exploring how we do that whole business of sharing power and trying to understand how you can bring people in to a public organization. And clearly, in order to do that, well, maybe not clearly, it's really difficult. In fact, it's impossible to run an organization like mine on a purely commercial basis. So we have to get money. And we have to get money off people who just want to give it to us. And they are mainly, in my world, they are mainly large foundations. They're sometimes also public sector organizations who might commission. And understandably, we have to be able to show to them in some way what on earth the impact is of the work that we're doing based on that funding. And what we're not able to do is to explain how we've helped somebody find somewhere to live, because we haven't, or how we've helped them get a job. We might have done, but we would have been one of many and we wouldn't have been central to that process. But we have done, and there were many other things that we might have done, but it would be hard to prove. But what we do know is that we've helped people have a really transformative experience, but it's really hard to work out how to describe that, or even to know really what that is, because it's very different from individual to individual and from activity to activity. So the whole business of trying to count that, or trying to make that a kind of logical process that you can sit easily in some kind of log frame, is really difficult. And we tried really hard to do that. We would interview people, ask them to fill in forms, we would count lots of things. And to be honest, I never even believed my own numbers. In fact, a lot of the way in which the funding system is set up is it encourages people like me to endlessly overclaim them when we're trying to raise the money, then overclaim them when we're reporting on the money. It endlessly asks us to count things that we don't even believe ourselves. An easy example would be that we might be asked, for example, in a funding application, say how many people who are homeless we're going to work with over the course of the year. And I will optimistically put in, say, 100. And then at the end of the year, I'll ask my colleagues and I'll find out that we've worked with 120. Bingo, I can put 120 in the report. But what I know is that about 80 of them simply touched the project, simply touched the work. About another 10 had a really interesting experience. Another 10 might have a fascinating experience, but 20 of them had a totally transformative experience. That 120 doesn't tell you anything about them. And yet that number is then used on an aggregated basis by the funder alongside all the other numbers they collected from their other grantees. And some big statement will be made about the thousands of people that have been helped by this grant program, based on a number that doesn't mean anything at all. So we were deeply dissatisfied with that. It also wasted an awful lot of our time because it pretends to be rigorous, but it isn't. So what we did was we were inspired by the most significant change methodology, which you can Google and learn about, and is mainly used in international development. And we've developed that over time. Initially, we did it just for ourselves, where we used a storytelling approach, which we sometimes call an outcomes-free zone, which is quite a contentious phrase. But it's basically going in and asking people to tell us stories, not based on a kind of case study or an interview process, but based on conversations with guiding questions that enable people to express for themselves what has happened for themselves and what mattered most to them. And then to use a process which is really clearly defined to move from those spoken stories into shorter edited versions that are more manageable, and a check back with the storyteller, retaining the storyteller's voice. And then those stories are then looked at by a whole range of people, not just one consultant sitting on their own, a whole range of people with relationships to the work to analyze what the meaning might be from those stories. And then that analysis is then used to inform our learning and future work and to report when that's helpful. And we did that for ourselves, and we found it absolutely transformational in that we suddenly understood things about our work that we'd never understood before. And we thought, great, we've hit on something that we can use. And then came the pandemic. And in the pandemic, we were looking for ways in which we could be helpful. And we found that there were many organizations doing absolutely fascinating work they'd never done before because of the pandemic. And so we offered up this methodology as a way of trying to understand the impact that they were doing. And we started to work with lots of different organizations, and more people got interested. We've now worked with over 90 organizations over the last 2 years, training and supporting them to think about meaningful measurement more broadly and training them around this methodology. And I'll come back to some of the implications of that in a moment. But I think for me, the crucial things within it is that it centers the voices of the people who are closest to the work, not necessarily those who one might label a participant or a beneficiary, but also the workers involved in that work, or the volunteers, or the people closely associated with it. Their voices are at the heart of the learning. And we're not extracting from that for our own purposes. What we are, but we're not centering that. We're centering hearing what they're saying. That raises really interesting questions about power, about who is controlling the narrative about what is important and what is being learned. The second thing that happens is that the people involved in the process of learning, suddenly the business of learning becomes the day job. It becomes central to the work. Instead of an annoying afterthought at the end of a piece of work that you have to do for the funder, it becomes the point of the work, and it adds value to the work. It's creative and enjoyable for those concerned. Both the people telling their stories and the people collecting them are learning and exploring, and we're finding data as a result of that we know is rigorous because it's absolutely coming from the people directly involved. Our challenge is being able to take that data, that information, and make it useful to people who are a long way away from the work, because it's really hard to ask commissioners and funders to read loads of stories and loads of very long reports. They much prefer a graph. But one of the things, again, we'll come back to is some of the ways in which we made progress with commissioners and funders in how they think about reporting and the connection between learning and accountability, which we think sometimes gets muddled. I've got loads more to say, but I'm going to just pause so as not.
Okay, no, thank you. That's great. And we will come back to a lot of those points. But I want to ask Karim to reflect, because you work in very different contexts.
Yeah.
So what would this look like, this storytelling approach to impact measurement in the context you've worked in? Maybe just tell us a little bit about those contexts first.
Yeah, and it's funny, we are in very different contexts. A lot of my work is around impact investing, particularly working for investors who have this kind of blend of financial returns and social impact or environmental impact that they're seeking. But there is some return component which really does change the dynamic around expectations. In some cases helpful, in other cases unhelpfully, we could argue. But I'll give an example from some practice research we've been doing, some colleagues and I, over the last few years, where the stories we heard were actually ventures, so not individuals. But and the kind of context for this was in impact investing in particular. Over the last decade, there's been a lot of progress around standards and tools and frameworks. There's also been a lot more capacity building. There's a lot more awareness. Investors say they're doing this. So in theory, this is, doing measurement should be easy or easier. The reality is it's not still particularly easy. And when you ask any social venture what their experience of measurement looks like, chances are they've got a pained look on their face, or they've got some baggage that they don't want to really unleash on you right away. And someone like me is often responsible for being that interface between the investor and the enterprise to try and understand what are the questions they're asking, what are the right tools and approaches, and what are the ways in which they can actually get the right data. So, it's similar, but actually quite different from the organizational perspective. In this research, our guiding question is, how do ventures experience the journey of thinking about the right questions and approaches for measurement, given all the stuff they now have access to that in theory should be relatively straightforward? And one of our hypotheses was that pretty much as ventures grow, their questions and their comfort and their data will grow with them. So it's a fairly straightforward story in the same ways we think about scaling. We have scaling phases, therefore we will have phases of sophistication around measurement. We heard something completely different. We heard that ventures actually don't go through a linear, almost predictable journey around the tools, approaches, and comfort level around measurement. In fact, the journey around impact and around measurement is as dynamic as the entrepreneurial journey. At every phase of whatever approach or business model or customer segment they're in, they're often asking different sets of questions that don't necessarily have a direct relationship to their stage of fundraising, right? They might be introducing a new product. They might have been an external shock, like COVID. They might have decided as a team that there's an untapped opportunity to increase their impact by beginning to explore a new area that they haven't yet tapped into. These are very different types of impact questions, which all demand different types of impact measurement approaches. And so we found that ventures were very clear on that. What ended up happening was they were getting asked by investors to use certain kinds of approaches and tools that were being developed and kind of legitimized at a field level that were not aligned or even appropriate with the questions that they wanted to ask. And so measurement was hard, not because it's hard to do, it's because both sides are asking different questions and insisting on different types of approaches. And so the big theme from this was actually misalignment. That measurement is hard because there's misalignment. And we heard the stories of ventures, and this guide is called Ventures at the Helm. We profiled a number of different ventures that were at different stages of their questions and of the tools and approaches that they were deploying. And what we found is that inductively, we came up with these 4 phases, which are actually non-linear. You can move through these phases at different periods. And it was quite fascinating because we assumed there'd be some linearity and relationship between the phases, but actually ventures moved in and out of these phases quite dynamically, which is quite interesting because it means that if your movement around the venture itself is dynamic, well, your measurement should be dynamic as well. It just makes sense. You can't hold your measurement static and expect the venture to pivot and respond and grow and scale and be value generating and still measure the same things. And so the challenge is that when your measurement is externally imposed on you in a static way, and you're answering somebody else's questions, at the same time as you're trying to answer your own questions, it gets really hard to generate value for measurement. And so one of the implications from this is that actually ventures can be clear on their questions, which they often are, but then they need to take additional steps to be able to be clear to their investors around what questions and tools are most appropriate for them. Now, investors want to help too. And so they need to also understand how to ask the right kinds of questions to their ventures and to support them with the right set of tools. Back to my prove, improve, learn, actually what we used to see is that investors were asking ventures for standardized metrics or certain ways of measurement that were actually not appropriate for the phase that we're in. If they were asking customers, what is the experience of the product or service that you're getting? And is it better than a comparable product or service? Do you even have an alternative? Well, a standardized metric doesn't really tell you that. In other cases, when the venture is somewhat mature or it's beginning to think about how it might scale in different geographies, well, some of those standardized metrics are completely appropriate. And so I think the big balancing act we have right now, when we listen to the stories of ventures, is how do you ask the right questions? How do you capture the right information? And how do you do it on both sides to be able to ensure there's more alignment, or at the very least, less misalignment? That was a quite counterintuitive finding from this research. And in fact, it's now forced, I think, many impact investors to rethink what good measurement looks like, because it shouldn't be just good for the investor, it should be good for the venture.
Okay.
So maybe I'll pause there.
No, that's great. Thank you. And so I want to pick up on this and ask you about, because what you described initially, before you started using storytelling as a method for impact measurement, was a state of misalignment, right?
Yes,
that then things were being imposed on you, and you were able to break through that.
Yeah.
Not without challenges, I gather. So tell us how you were able to do that. How did you start to be able to work with funders to help them see, despite this sort of tradition of imposing, let's just count the number of people who came through kind of metrics. Despite that tradition, you've been able to work with funders, and they, I think, now are starting to see this as a valuable approach as well.
So this isn't straightforward in the sense that it's not the same story with every funder, and it's not the same story around every situation. But I do think, just as you suggested as well, Karim, in your work, that there's momentum now around this question. And there is a bit of a myth, I think, amongst a lot of grantees, certainly in the world that I'm in the UK, which is that we're all being beaten over the head by these nasty, kind of aggressive funders making us do stupid measurement. And actually, if you go and talk to the funders, they want to solve this problem too. They find that receiving reports that don't tell them anything useful is not great. They don't like it either. And some of them are stuck in their own historical processes that they're trying to break out of and find more creative ways of doing. And that isn't just the more imaginative foundations who you'd expect to lead on that. That is also people like local authorities who you wouldn't expect to be jumping into that space very quickly because they're quite risk averse, generally speaking. But our experience is that they are keen to have these conversations. So I'll give an example, which is where the local authority here, the City Council, we work with both, complicatedly, we have two local authorities, but the City Council have a grants program, a small grants program to small charities in the city. And they wanted to understand the impact of that grant. And what they would normally do is ask all their grantees to collect traditional data in traditional ways. And they have been working with us and actually realized how dissatisfied they were with that. So they asked us to do a piece of work. And what we suggested was, yes, there are certain things you can ask for on a form, which is absolutely fair enough because it's data that is easily collected on a form, like what have you spent and how many people have you seen is worth knowing. But if you want to understand people's experience of it, we're going to collect some stories. And we could only collect a few. So we brought together a whole lot of, not all the grantees, just a few of the grantees, and asked them to introduce us to various people who benefited from their work. And we collected about 20 stories. We then had the most fascinating discussion where we brought together those partners and others into a room, having read the stories, to talk about the impact of the work, which would very vary because the grants were going to very different kinds of charities. And two things came out of that were, for me, absolutely fascinating. The first one was I was in the room, and a lot of the organizations that were in that room, I had known for years. I've been knocking around Oxford for far too long. I'd known them for years. I've been in meetings with these people for years. This was the first time I'd understood what they did. I talked to them about their budgets. I talked to them about their ambition, about their mission statements, about their internal HR problems, all the rest of it. I never understood the impact of the work before. I'd never heard that before. And they all had the same experience, as did the local authority. What the local authority officers then did was they had to find a way of trying to use this to report to their cabinet, the leaders of the council, who are used to having reports in a certain format. They get an awful lot of paperwork. They're busy people, and they have it in a certain format. So they, instead of giving it in that traditional format, they gave them some stories, and they gave them the analysis of the stories that came out of the discussion group. And then they crossed their fingers. And what happened was that only one of the councillors on that and the cabinet, that's the leadership of the council, only one failed to read the stories. That's already a fantastic result. And secondly, what they said, absolutely all of them, what they said was, this is the first time we've started to understand the impact of our grant programme. This report does not tell us how many people did X, Y, or Z, and it doesn't tell us much about the money. We need to know that separately. But finally, we've actually heard what the impact is for the people living in the city. So they suddenly said, why aren't we doing this all the time? It's not easy to do all the time because there's massive capacity issues for organizations to do this kind of work and massive capacity issues for the people receiving it. So there's no simple answer to that. So I don't want to pretend that there is. But the fact that people are hungry to do that, I think, is really interesting. And just to go back to the original thing about some of our bigger funders, I mean, one story I quite like to tell is that I was with a foundation who never funded us before, and we were explaining the work, and she was very enthusiastic, and then asked, and I explained how we work and how we measured. And she then said, yes, do apply, and sent me the link to their form. Their form was awful. It was asking me all sorts of questions which are unanswerable. Until, you know, how many people you're going to work with in 4 years' time? I have no idea. So you just make numbers up and all of it. And I really hated the form, but I wanted the money. So I filled the form in, and then I wrote a 6-page Word document, which was titled, these are the answers to the questions I wish you'd asked. And it talked about how we would try and understand the work and how we would try and learn from it and how we would try and tell them about what we'd learned. So I sent off the online form, and then I sent an email with an attachment saying, I know this is really cheeky, but this is what I wish you'd asked me to write. And she wrote straight back and said, I'm sending that to my trustees. We're not going to bother with the internet form. And I don't tell you that to try and big myself up. I tell you that to big her up, because they were open to that. They were open to being challenged, and they were open to thinking differently. So I think we shouldn't be scared about pushing back if what we know we're doing is trying honestly and openly to accept that it's complicated and messy. But I'd rather do something messy that is going for the truth than doing something tidy that is distracting us from the truth.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think there's a really powerful lesson in here about taking that first risk, right? And to really say, here's what would be valuable, right? And then it's opened it up, right? And others can see that as well. So just any reflection?
Yeah, I would just say that, I mean, in some ways what you've described, and to one of the points you made earlier, there is a broader pushback of these traditional ways of thinking about measurement and working, which are really rooted in a compliance and reporting orientation. You know, and so unpacking that and saying, like, sure, we have to do some base level of that for taxpayers and fiduciary. There's a number of different legitimate reasons. But if the burden of that always falls squarely on the organizations that have to do the work, you know, that is difficult. But also, if that information is not used to actually make better decisions in the future, that's even worse, because sometimes it's the long forms that very few people read, and in fact are not used in the way that they could be used for forward-looking decision-making. But these are issues around that are rooted in history, in accepted ways of working, that are now being challenged in quite productive ways, because in some ways we're trying to figure out what does better look like, and can we prove it? And so, as you were saying with this foundation, the fact that they now have something that they know could work better, and that could be an acceptable way of working, and it could work for you as an organization, that's a better desired future in some ways than the status quo. And I think in impact investing, while it's very still top-down, metrics-driven, standards-driven, et cetera, there has been initial and probably in some places significant pushback from organizations that say, sure, we can count stuff, but it doesn't really tell you or us what really change looks like. And in fact, if we're in the business of change and not in the business of just counting, then isn't there a mismatch between what you're getting and what we're trying to do collectively? And I think enough organizations on both sides are recognizing the limitations of the existing paradigms. It's still not easy to shift all of that because, as you were saying, there's like layers of organizational bureaucracy, trustees, fundraising, forms. I think one implication is if we can show what better looks like, we have a higher chance of getting there. And in impact investing, one example is, many of you have probably heard of 60 decibels, come out of a firm called Acumen, one of the leading impact investors. 60 decibels does some really interesting work around collecting, the kind of direct experiences of customers or users, beneficiaries of social enterprises and social ventures. And so they use technology to survey people via voice and kind of mobile phones and just ask them the direct questions. And now can do that at a level of scale and coverage and price point that is actually quite reasonable relative to what it used to be before. And by showing that it's actually possible to do that at scale, to do it in a way that is credible, and to now reconstruct this notion of what a good benchmark is. Typically, we know what benchmarks are, right? They're top-down, metrics-driven in a standardized way. They've constructed bottom-up benchmarks based on what people say change looks like for them. So it's quite fascinating when you can imagine an alternative to the classic benchmark that is driven in a certain paradigm that is organizational, to shifting it to say, well, what would a individual and kind of social change-centric benchmark actually look like? And so I think this is almost like part of the journey of change is, yeah, you can push back, but as you propose alternatives, those alternatives have to be quite compelling and usable. And I think across the board, we're beginning to see funders, investors, and ventures, use those and propose those in ways that perhaps there wasn't a lot of space for before. And partly is the frustration with the existing ways of working. I think COVID really made everybody do a big reset and question, like, why do we do things the way we do? And at least we have space for some better answers.
It sounds like COVID opened up for you all an opportunity to share an interest and a need for the storytelling approach that you've been able to share much more widely with other organizations.
I think that's true. And I think what it also did was took us into thinking about what the significance of this is more broadly.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that, so we're very preoccupied with this particular method, the storytelling methodology, but it's only really part of a bigger conversation about meaningful measurement. And of course, the storytelling is just one way of exploring meaningful measurement, and Karim and others will know a lot more about many other approaches. So the bigger question is meaningful measurement. But meaningful measurement only sits within an even bigger question, which is about organizational culture and about systems change. It's about how you think about what is the work and what's important in the work, and how do you try and center human relationships and connection at the heart of the work, and the impact it has on people, on individual people at the heart of the work. And a meaningful measurement approach that enables people to see the value of being alongside people and listening to them actually doesn't just give you, my view, better quality data for the purpose of learning. It also changes and improves the way people deliver their work and practice. And it was really interesting. I was at an event recently where the CEO of a small charity, again, local charity that works with families with early years kids, completely outside of my world in terms of my professional practice, which their organization had been on our training and done some work with us, and they'd used this storytelling methodology. And when she got up and talked about it, she talked about the learning, but then she said what she didn't expect was that it would also change how her staff worked. She thought it might improve how they learned, but she didn't realize it would actually change the culture of the organization. People started to talk differently about what mattered in the work. And that was the surprise, because it took this really basic, obvious question of what is most important about what we do. It made that central. And so often we're constrained by something that appears to come down from commissioners in the sense that the commission, this is, again, I'm using the language of my world, which might not be yours, but commissioners might, within their tender documents, whatever, they might have various KPIs, key performance indicators, and staff will be encouraged by their managers to be working to those KPIs. And that seems to be the obvious thing, because that's what we're being funded to do. So you're working towards things like, how many referrals have you made? How quickly did you answer the phone? How many times were you able to deliver X, Y, or Z? How many people did you manage to get into A, B, or C? Because those are the KPIs. That's obviously what my job is. But as soon as you say, actually, that isn't your job is to look at the person in front of you, do the best thing you can do with that person and learn, and then demonstrate your learning. That's your job. Then you're no longer obsessed with how quickly you answer the phone. You're now obsessed with, what did I actually do and what did I learn from it? So the changing the metric changes the practice. And that, for me, is the most significant thing about it.
Can I just double down on that? Because we found something similar, again, at the organizational level and with social ventures, is when you have aligned measurement, it actually supports the creation and delivery of impact. So the organization is more empowered and enabled to actually do the things in more effective, efficient, and targeted ways. Misaligned measurement actually hinders the organization's ability to do the work, or to do it in the ways that actually have transformative impact. And we saw multiple instances of how organizations describe that. And for us, again, that was quite troubling, because, you know, there's a cost to doing things the way we're doing them right now. And that's not captured necessarily anywhere, but on frontline organizations, intermediate organizations, they see it every day. And sometimes it's not visible kind of more broadly. So I think the other kind of shift that you're advocating, and I think we're beginning to see, is the status quo imposes a kind of set of consequences of measurement that are not helpful or undesirable, and actually at odds with the impact we're trying to create. Shifting that is as important as almost just getting more funding and getting more systems change, et cetera. In this way, like, changing how you measure changes your ability to actually have impact. And I think sometimes that is lost, because measurement feels like the thing, as you were saying, like the thing you do after, when for a lot of us, that is the work. We're trying to shift what gets measured, how it gets measured, you know, what good measurement looks like. And if we only think about it as the reporting, if you conflate measurement and reporting, then we're almost like losing its transformative power. And I think that's the intersection of like measurement and systems change, which we're, I mean, collectively here trying to unpack.
A very bold, I'll just briefly, there's a very bold commissioner in the southwest of England who were a mental health system, stripped away all the KPIs and just said, what you're required to do is to tell me how you're going to learn and what you've learned. That is a requirement. So suddenly everyone had to go, oh, I now have to think about how I'm going to learn and how I'm going to communicate what I've learned. That's become my job. And it really confused a lot of people and caused a lot of problems. Because, well, that's not how we do things, you know, we just, you know, but actually it was a really brilliant challenge.
I think what's so powerful about this approach, right, and it picks up on what you're saying, is that it's, you know, measurement had become, or in many contexts still is, seen as an end, right? And we work to the KPI. And this not only flips that, so it's put back as a means to a broader end, but it's not just the end of learning and improving how to do what we do, but as you've alluded to, it upends the power dynamics. It helps people sort of recenter on relationships and the human beings with whom they're connecting. And that's what really unlocks the role of measurement in systems change, where the real potential is, I think. So, okay, that sounds incredibly exciting. And it's not without its challenges. And so I just want to, before we'll open it up to questions from all of you in a few minutes, but I just want to ask you to share and reflect on, where have the bumps in the road been? What are some of the challenges? And what does it take? What has it taken? What will it take to overcome them? And I'm thinking, you know, Jeremy, in your context, particularly the shift in the culture of the organization, the shifts in human behavior that I'm sure have been required to make this happen.
So I think, first of all, it's quite hard to talk about quickly. And so you have to be able to get people in a room for long enough over a long enough period to understand what we're talking about and why. And that is a challenge. So we've got very enthusiastic commissioners at the moment we're talking with about this stuff, but I can't get their attention for long enough to get beyond, yes, so what are we going to do? And how, you know, and that's a real challenge because people are busy. And I think the second big challenge for us is that it does take time. You've got to be prepared to give up time to listen, to think, to reflect, to wonder, to be a bit confused. And it's not neat and tidy. And again, we're all too busy and we're all got, you know, there's too many other things we have to do. And actually, within my own organization, it's very ironic that within my organization, we're banging on about this with partners all the time. And we find it really hard to do it ourselves. Really hard to just get everyone in a room to stop and look at what we've been doing and think about the meaning of that and use the stories to help us do that. So creating that capacity is really, really tricky. And then to ask other organizations, especially organizations which are frontline, really stretched, don't have a kind of whole research program or a whole unit to support them with this stuff, is really difficult. So there's a kind of there's a culture change around whether this matters and how one would do it. But there's also a culture change needed around capacity, about what you prioritize amongst all the things that you have to do. And there's absolutely no quick fix to that. I don't have the answer to it. But it is, for us, the biggest thing we've got to address, because we talk the whole time about how relationships are the most important thing, about how learning is central to our work. And then we're all running around all day, trying to answer emails, deal with the accounts, sort out this, sort out that. And we haven't managed to reconcile those two things. So I think that's our biggest challenge.
Challenges that you see and have grappled with.
I think this one maybe is another version of some of what you're describing, is this, and this relates to some of your research, is this idea to be able to hold these often multiple and competing perspectives at the same time as you do the work. It's really hard to hold those individually, but perhaps as teams you can do that. So what that means is sometimes you might need to do short-term measurement, and other times you're really concerned about the long-term transformation and what that looks like. Sometimes you will really need simple 3 KPIs, and that's what you're going to work with in a defined period. Other times you're really looking at more qualitative, inquiry-based approach. You know, sometimes you are trying to think about program design, like how do we design a better version for this specific group? And other times you're saying, isn't this program actually perpetuating the kinds of issues we say we shouldn't be addressing? And it, you know, there's similar issues like that. And for individuals to hold those competing, almost like perspectives and priorities over time is not only challenging, it's exhausting. But for teams to do that and organizations to do that, I think that's the kind of the secret to doing this well. And sometimes it's not individual organizations as well. It could be working with partners. And I think the center here has done some of that, where if an organization, for example, is doing a lot of the kind of day-to-day work, it's hard to then pull out and say, what are the system level implications? And so maybe you have to have a partner to help you with that. But I think the comfort level of organizations to be able to at least acknowledge that there are more than one, you know, almost like space on the spectrum. Where are you most comfortable? What else is important? Should you be playing on both sides? And what are the ways you can pause every so often and try to understand the relationship between those perspectives? That's really hard, but actually, if you put in time for that, it's doable. And I've worked with at least a number of organizations where if you define a kind of a learning agenda, you know, you integrate in your strategic review, you're able to bring it to your board. There are a number of tactics in terms of embedding this in a way that learning is the work, not the thing you do after the work. But it has to be across an organization. So these days I'm doing a lot of work with boards, and I'm finding that's one of the biggest gaps and opportunities. When you bring boards non-financial information, often they struggle a little bit to interpret and answer the questions in the same way as their confidence is with financial information. But if we're in the business of impact and we have impact data, and your board is not as comfortable with impact data as it is with financial data, then we need to change some things around, even in terms of upskilling your board, getting some new people on there, or shifting the way that they get comfortable with this kind of data or the interplay between them. So I think there's a number of tactics that organizations can use to deal with that. But I think the challenges are really holding those ends of the spectrum on multiple dimensions and recognize that it's okay to feel uncomfortable, but you can get over that, if you're smart about it. And I think in some ways, the meaningful measurement conversation is doing that at multiple levels for organizations, for groups of organizations, and then also at the system level as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both. We're going to open it up to questions from those of you here in the room and also those of you joining online. I'm sure you've already been typing comments and questions in the chat, and we'll pick some of those up as well and bring them into the conversation. Yes, Jude.
Well, thank you very much, both of you. It was very, very inspiring. Got two questions related to what you were saying with the stories and the fact that lots of donors are interested about quantitative stuff and like they want to see a graph, as you said. So the first thing is just to understand you have developed some sort of a framework or a methodology how to collect stories. Is that true?
Yeah.
And do you also teach the public or people?
Yeah.
Anybody who's interested in it?
So we do bespoke training for particular organizations to help them when they're intending to use the methodology, and we'll help them in their process. We have a series of trainings we'll take them through. But we also have open classes. The next ones are in May. If you go on the Evalysis website, you can find them where you can just sign up and anyone can attend those training events. And as I say, if we're doing it bespoke for an organization, obviously we'll tailor it to the thing that they're looking at, whereas the open ones are more general in terms of introducing to the methodology. There's a 6-stage kind of process that we can talk you through, and we can also then add on training around skills associated with certain elements of that process, as well as a general introduction. So yeah, that training is available. And yeah, if you can't find it on the website, then somehow get hold of me and I'll talk you through it.
And I should also say we are working together to produce a case study of this approach with a master's student who I think is here somewhere in the room, Jonas. So we'll be putting something out as the center as well in partnership with Oak Fire Station to document the approach.
So I had a second part of the question I can pull into this. So I imagine that when you showed stories to donors or people who provided you with resources and funds, that they were excited, but were there any donors who were still like, okay, but I'm interested in like scale, show me some numbers, show me some graph, and if yes, like what did you do then?
So that people must still be interested in numbers, scale. I get how this is transformational, but at what scale are we talking? Okay,
so the first thing, they don't just we do send the stories and we hope they read them, but we don't expect everyone to read the stories. There's a lot of time. So they also get a report, and the report summarizes key findings from the stories, but also summarizes our analysis of those stories, which the analysis is done as a participatory activity as well, but does end up as a report with some bullets which tell you these are the things that have been learned. So we're not just asking people to read stories. They will also get an analysis, so they're helped into the meaning and learning that's come from it. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that we still play the game. If people need some numbers, we'll give them the numbers. And sometimes those are useful, sometimes they're not, but you just have to do what you have to do. And some organizations understand us really well, so they're not going to ask us for things that don't mean anything, and they're happy for us to share our learning in the way that works for us. Some organizations don't know us very well, and they just need the data that they need for them to send up the line, and we'll give them the data they need.
Thank you all so much for your time. I have a related question on the process to analyze the stories. So do you use the same process every time, the same guiding process, or how do you approach?
So there's the stages of the process is there's recruiting and training story collectors. That's a whole thing. There's the recruitment and the support of the storytellers. Then there's the storytellers and the collectors have their conversation. Then there's the transcribing and the editing of those stories. All these sound really simple, but that has to be done with great care. And then we get to the analysis, the participatory analysis, and then which I'll come back to. And then the final one is the report writing and the sharing of those stories, which can be done really creatively. We've made films and animations, and we've even made a quilt. All sorts of ways we can share the stories as well as reports. But in that fifth element, the analysis, we basically have we asked 2 questions over the course of quite a lengthy discussion with as many people as we can bring together who have a relationship with the work, but have a very diverse relationship with the work. And the first one is very open. It's intentionally not asking people to bring what they think the project should have done, but to bring what have the stories told us that the project did. So what surprised them? What are the themes emerging from the stories? Then the second, and we have that conversation, and that's recorded, and we go into that in considerable depth. The second question is, yeah, now let's take the things that we're hoping from that would happen in the project. We would have had outcomes or themes or ambition for that project. Let's take those things and go back to the stories and say, do the stories help us understand whether that happened or it didn't? So you can then have you're then looking at 2 things which subdivide. One is, without any precondition about what this should have done, what have we discovered that it did do? And then bearing in mind what we wanted to do, did it do it? And actually, interestingly, that second conversation is really important because we wanted it to, I don't know, help people develop their skills. We want to know whether it did or not, and we find out from the stories. But in the first conversation is we find the things that really matter most. And the first time, sorry to go on, but the first time we ever used it, which is why we was completely sold on it, we ended up rewriting our mission statement as a result. And that's how powerful it was for us. Because we thought, we were collecting stories from artists, from people with experience of homelessness, from staff, from volunteers, from partners we work with, from members of the public who used the place. And it was quite a big process. And what we found, that the one thing that went right across all the stories was about relationships and connection. So the emerging artist who got their first ever exhibition into a gallery, the most important thing for them was not that they got their art in a gallery, it was that they made friends and connected with people and found people who were like-minded. The person who was homeless, it wasn't that they found somewhere to live or got a job, it was that they made friends and they connected with people and they felt they belonged somewhere. And we suddenly realized, oh my goodness, we thought we were an art center trying to include people in that, and that's what we did. And then we realized that all of that was just a vehicle to help people connect. And we suddenly discovered what we were there for. And we only discovered it by asking those questions, those open questions. If we'd asked closed questions, which was, how cool was it for you to get your art in a gallery? Yes, or, then we'd have only found out about that. But because we asked the open question, we discovered something much more powerful.
I would just say it's such a powerful example. And it's partly that you asked the question, but also that you listened to the data and responded. And that is so important and often very hard to do. Other questions? Yeah.
The 2 quick questions. I just want to understand in the prove, learn model, which I absolutely love, what is the distribution you've seen in the ecosystem? Do you think it's still very heavily, the pie is very heavy towards the prove? Or social enterprises were still like kind of spending resources in the improve and learn aspect as well? And second, this of course ties into my following question, which is about money in impact assessment, because it's expensive to run impact assessment. And what I want to understand is, how is the responsibility sharing landscape looking right now between the funder and the enterprise? Because especially where I come from, it is usually the enterprise's responsibility to come up with the data that the funders even want.
Yeah.
Even if they are in the learn mode or pivot mode.
Yeah.
So is that narrative kind of shifting right now, and what's looking like?
Really good questions. I'll give you one take, at least like from where I sit. And I'm much more optimistic, I think, about both of those questions than I probably was a couple of years ago. I would say it still feels more like a prove dominance, like the dominance of prove questions, but that is changing. Particularly when we move, for example, from a single thematic issue-based focus, which I think has dominated for a long time, even in investment, where I'm an ag funder, or I work in this kind of region, et cetera, to recognizing that actually a lot of the issues are multidimensional. And almost by definition, if you're operating across multiple sectors or organization types, you are asking different kinds of questions. And therefore, if you only have prove metrics or approaches, you're missing out on some of this, not only the good stuff, but actually what you say you're doing or why you're differentiated. And every fund or investor that says they're differentiated will have to back it up with this combination of prove, improve, and learn, as opposed to just the prove metrics. I think also because prove often feels quantitative, targeted, metrics oriented, there's been a realization of the limitations of some of that without the right kind of context. And, you know, in some ways, meaningful measurement is at the other end of that spectrum of it's all context. And I think what we're finding is, like, for each type of investor, there is a combination that works for them. So in some cases, large organizations might still have like a 2/3 prove, 1/3, you know, improve, and very little learning. We've got new family offices that are actually mostly about improve and learning. Or you might have other types of funders that say, what is the right proportion? You know, we're new at this, so let's actually have an open kind of conversation about that. So I'm quite optimistic from what I've been seeing now, but I would say that there's still established ways of working that prioritize prove, while those organizations are recognizing and grappling with the limitations of some of what they've done around prioritizing prove approaches. But your second question is also not unrelated around this kind of distribution piece. And I'll go back to this practice research that I highlighted. What we found is actually these conversations are not really just about the technical issues in measurement. And this is where there's a big gap and an opportunity. One of the things we teach in the program is actually impact measurements as much behavioral and relational as it is technical. And when you begin to grapple with the consequences of that, you can get some new opportunities to do measurement differently. So with this toolkit, so we did this big report. The thing that we did that's kind of fun is we converted it into a series of worksheets for both ventures and investors. The venture worksheets are a series of questions that ask them, you know, what are the questions that you're most interested in? What are the things that you are feeling and facing right now? Here's what other ventures said in these different phases that you can expect to feel or see or be challenged by. And here's the kinds of tools and approaches that may be appropriate for your phase. So it's actually a diagnostic plus a set of advice to try and get more alignment between the questions you're asking and the approaches that might be appropriate. And at the end of that, there's actually another worksheet that's a script. And you take all the results from the questions you're asking, the things that matter to you, the constraints you have, and actually write out the basis of the conversation you can have with your investor. Because there's a power dynamic involved. Imagine a venture that is trying to raise money, telling their investor, you're actually asking me for the wrong information, but I still need you to wire over that money. You know, that's a really hard conversation. Some investors are very open to that. Many might not be. But if you go through a structured process to say, here's the questions we're asking, here's why we think these are the right questions, here's the questions we would like to ask at some other point, but not today. And based on these questions, here's the right kinds of approaches and tools that matter for us. What do you think? We also did a similar process for the investor, where we asked the investors, run through these questions, think about what your typical social enterprise or social venture looks like, and see whether you're providing the support and insisting on the tools that are appropriate for that phase. And often, having done this now in a variety of contexts, you see a very deliberate mismatch. Often it's saying, hey, here's a set of standardized metrics. Please report once a year or once a quarter. And we may pay you a little bit more, but probably not. But in fact, if you're trying something new, the venture may need some capacity building. They may need access to data. They may need the ability to even have a conversation with another portfolio company. And so we had this set of investor tools that asked them to be clear about their expectations, that then also gave them a menu of ways to think about how they might support ventures IMM. And so to this question of who pays and who gets value, et cetera, we challenged that when we said, it's actually only partially about money. Investors have so much more to offer to ventures to actually realize the value of IMM. They can provide access to tools, to data, to learning, to strategic relationships, to be able to convert also some of this data into insights in ways that actually allow the venture to succeed in follow-on fundraising rounds. So we find that this two-sided conversation is much more helpful, but you also have to acknowledge the kind of constraints around the existing precedents, as you were saying. Right now, there's an expectation that certain things have to happen in certain ways. I mean, hopefully in the future, impact measurement is seen to be as valuable and as kind of integrated as accounting and, just what we normally do when we buy software, et cetera. The reality is right now, we think of it as a cost rather than as a value driver. And that has to shift from both sides. If one side thinks that the value of impact measurement is I have to report upwards, and the other says, well, I have to report annually, that's just a cost. If ventures can get more value from measurement by doing what they do better, and investors can take that and say, yeah, this is what I'm actually in the business of doing, and I would fund and invest differently, then we begin to have a different answer to your question of who pays and who gets value. If we're not changing those dynamics, we're going to end up in the same place we are right now, which is let's have a reporting and compliance and accountability mindset, which we need some of, but I don't think is the full picture.
Okay, thank you. So we're at time. So what I'm going to suggest is, I'm sure there were questions online. We'll collect those. We'll share them with you too, and we'll perhaps share some responses with the community. And we will now be going into reception. So those of you who are here in the room, I hope you'll stay and join us, and there'll be a chance to talk with Jeremy and Karim. I just want to thank you both for a fantastic discussion. Really wonderful. Thank you so much. I hope you'll all stay for reception. There is some refreshments from Damascus Rose Kitchen, which is a local social enterprise that supports refugee women in Oxford and is housed at the old fire station. So a lovely connection there. And we have our next seminar on April 19th. We'll be in discussion with colleagues from Ashoka about a forthcoming playbook on climate agency. We'll be sending out information about that soon. And then finally, I mentioned the Marmalade Festival at the beginning that the old fire station runs. It's April 9 through 12 at the Skull World Forum. And Jeremy, do you want to say one quick thing about it?
Really briefly, it's an annual festival. Do come along. I just want you, just so you get a sense of it, last year was the biggest one we ever did alongside the Skull World Forum. We had 93 organizations apply. We ran a few dropped out. We ended up with 78 sessions from people, amazing thought leaders from right across the world, but also a lot of fantastic local projects getting involved as well. So do come. This year, to our amazement, we've had 347 applications to run sessions within those 4 days. They won't all get to run sessions. There isn't enough hours in the day, but it's an extraordinary range of people coming. But it only works if then people attend those sessions. It's all very well having all those groups running sessions, but if people don't go to them, then it's wasted everyone's time. So you should come. And my advice to you, I'm sure you're probably busy, but my advice is just block out 9th to the 12th all day, all 4 days, because it's going to be rich and full. And the program, we're busy scheduling at the moment. The program will go public at the end of the month. So go on to marmalade.io and have a look when that's up. Hope to see you there.
Can I make a plug for that? Because that's where we started the nuance of this kind of conversation. Yeah. So it was a panel session. We were both kind of exchanging ideas, and that literally blossomed into so much more over the last year. So I'd encourage all of you to check out as many sessions as you can, because you never know what seed gets planted, but also what type of collaboration or opportunity is going to come out of it. And we are literally the example of impact. I mean, I didn't want to use that overused, term, but in here, this is what it looks like. And I think that there's a lot of power in convening and sharing in ways that could be quite tangible, and open up some new opportunities, I think, as we have here. So,
excellent. Thank you. Thank you again.